Okay, so hi everybody. So I just started recording too, so make sure you keep it clean. Don't say anything you don't want recorded for posterity. So as you saw from the shared screen that I had up there, I'll pull it up again. Tonight we're going to talk about something very timely, and um, going to originally make this a more general webinar, but with the events of the day, it seemed really important, especially with the gun manufacturers through the NRA going on the offensive. And the messages they're using are very, very powerfully linked to people's psyches right now. And as many of you who are on here probably know, that the best way for us to start combating this is to evoke empathy. And the reason the images of the kids is so powerful is it's very in our human nature, our psychology, our physiology, our evolution to care for kids. So that is a powerful visual message that we should use along with our progressive values. So I also want to just kind of highlight that I had a really good experience this past Saturday in Sauk County, and started using some methods I'm going to use tonight to start getting people to form their own messages, use framing. And since all of you have a background in this, I think this will help solidify things in your mind and give you steps to do this effectively. Also, it works on any issue, so it will help you arrive at consistent messaging on issues. And I call them 5 steps to progressive framing. Woo! The first step is to think. And I think this works well with progressives because we all think of ourselves as being rational. So we want to reason to what is an effective message. And so in the steps for thinking, I'm using something that my colleague George Green in Minnesota came up with, which is based on the old fire safety campaign, which everybody remembers. Stop, drop, and roll. So think about it this way. First, you want to stop and think about the values being evoked in what you hear and what you're perceiving, because as all of you know, they're most likely conservative. Second step is you need to consciously decide to drop those conservative ideas and language behind the message that's happening. Because it's been embedded in your brains for so long, as everybody noticed in the workshop we did on Saturday, it's really hard to drop those conservative ideas unless you consciously, physically make an effort to do so. So you have to consciously decide to drop those ideas. And then you roll into the progressive frame on the issue. And as all of you know, and as the people on Saturday in Baraboo found out, again, easier said than done. But here's some ideas to get you there, at least on this issue. So the second step, so you have step 1 is this conscious idea of stop, drop, and roll. Step 2 is the idea that every issue needs to be framed around empathy. So as everybody knows, empathy is the core of progressive values. It's why we do what we do. It's why we care about what we care about. So I have a couple ideas there. And I'm going to, this is where it's open up to all of you. And if you have something to share, go ahead and unmute yourself. Or the other option is to use the chat box that's over on the side of your screen. You can do a chat box there. So let me move this. I have mine right in the middle of the screen there. There we go. So the chat box can be used as well to comment. So the first idea is this idea of empathy, and for kids, empathy for children, who pretty much widely accepted by everyone, the future of this country. That's, while it's metaphorical, it is also somewhat literal, are being killed and wounded by people using weapons that are too easy for anyone to get and use without any responsibility towards others. So this is an important idea, that obviously our freedom to do things, to have the rights that we have, come with a responsibility to other people's freedom. That's part of empathy. That's part of the progressive idea of democracy. So that evokes the idea of responsibility towards others as we would want for ourselves. Mark makes an interesting point. We'll get to that in a little bit, but they're not using empathy as a reason to put guns into schools. They're using the authoritarian idea of protection. So think of the authoritarian father being the one to have the responsibility alone to protect his kids. So in the view of the family, of the nation as a family metaphor, it is then the father's responsibility to protect the kids, not the government's. So the right is actually using their authoritarian vision, their hierarchical vision of how to protect kids when they talk about hardening schools, giving teachers guns to have in schools. That's them using their authoritarian view. And I've actually got something on that a bit later, so hold that thought. It might be able to add something else to that. And then the idea that it's against our values to put children's lives at risk because a few people care about selling deadly weapons rather than responsibility towards our fellow human beings, right? And this gets to the point of greed, self-interest, that you have these few gun manufacturers selling to a very small audience of people who are putting their desires, their self-interest, their profit, literally, over people's lives rather than taking responsibility for their freedom and their safety. So there's a couple kind of outlined ideas there to start evoking empathy when you start talking about gun safety. Also thinking of it as a public health issue can also be very important. And that goes along with the next slide of evoking step 3. So you've taken the first step, stop, drop, and roll consciously. Step 1 is to evoke empathy. Step 2 is evoke empathy. Step 3 is to evoke the idea of the public as the foundation of freedom and prosperity. So going back to Mark's comments, the NRA and the right is all about taking care of yourself, taking care of your own self-interest, your own freedom, protect just yourself and your family. Whereas for progressives, we think of it in terms of the public, to protect and empower people, having the responsibility in a democracy to care about others, provide resources and protections necessary for us to prosper and thrive. And the idea that through our government, we have not only the responsibility, but the power to protect children so they can grow up in a future and a society free from fear when they're in school or walking on the streets or whatever activity, right? So there's some really important ideas there about the public as the foundation for freedom and prosperity, and how we, the people, have not only the responsibility, but the power to act and do something to protect our fellow citizens. So that's very different from the NRA and the rights idea of personal protection, Right, to protect. The right is talking about personal protection, which is why people should have a gun to protect themselves. Why we should harden schools, put guns in the hands of teachers, because then the teacher is acting as the strict authoritarian father, as opposed to someone who is creating a nurturing learning environment. So hopefully those contrasts are becoming clear in these first three steps here. So I think this is perhaps the most important one, important step in this and any issue, is to know conservative ideas and metaphors and to stop using them. And feel free to throw in others here because there are a lot. I just put in 6 that were very easy to identify, and just a couple comments on each. The first one is gun control. And while the conversation is all about gun control, that's very much in the conservative frame, and it is something that makes it easier for conservatives to control the message and control discourse. Because in essence, when you're talking about gun control, you were talking about the idea of big government coming in and controlling people's, in the second idea, their right to own guns, their Second Amendment rights, their personal liberties, their personal freedom. So gun control is a hard message to stop saying. Exactly. Substitute gun safety instead. That's exactly what I would suggest, is to talk about gun safety, because that's what it's about. It's also about public health, and people's freedom to live without fear of being shot, literally.
Hey,
So,
Scott,
oh, yep, go ahead.
could I toss something in? I had this in the commenter call earlier this week. A reader sent it to me. Tom Hartman did an article, a column, I'm going to say 2 or 3 years ago, on the true history of the Second Amendment, which I did not know. I thought it was, the Minuteman at Lexington and Concord idea. But do you know why the Second Amendment was established? It was established to bring the southern states into the United States. And at that time, they were having a lot of slave rebellions and revolts in the South. And so there were local armed white militias that were going around to suppress those uprisings. And like every month, search the slave quarters to make sure there weren't weapons or maps to the north or whatever.
Cool.
I find it really powerful because there is this false myth about what the Second Amendment is about, that it was founded, grounded in freedom. In actuality, it was all about perpetuating slavery.
Interesting.
Yeah, I have that column up on the commenter call if anyone wants to see it. Just scroll down.
Sure. Very interesting. Good message from Steve there, too. Life is the first right proposed by the Declaration of Independence. Yeah, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And obviously, if you're afraid of being shot in your school, it's kind of hard to pursue life. So, another comment I have following up on what Mark just said is I'm actually reading, I'm finishing up a book called The Secret History of Wonder Woman, about the life of Charles Moulton and the women in his life. And there's an interesting little blurb there about the Second Amendment that I wasn't aware of this until I read it, that in the 1930s, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously that the Second Amendment is not about the individual right to bear arms. It's about supporting local, basically at the time, National Guard, reserve troops. So
the NRA even agreed with that.
And exactly, at the time, the NRA was about 80% sportsmen and hunters, and they actually filed an amicus brief with the Supreme Court saying, yes, it's not about the individual. So how far we've come. And, that goes back to this idea that I had in the first slide of, or I guess this empathy is the idea of a few people making a lot of money selling deadly weapons, again, to a very few people, that's just in their own self-interest. That's putting their self-interest above the lives of a lot of people. So I think those are all good things to consider. So the Second Amendment rights, obviously the way the Second Amendment has been framed, in spite of what Mark is saying, the origin of the Second Amendment was, so that needs to be reframed. The idea that it's a self-defense weapon, I actually, unfortunately, went on the NRA website to find a lot of these. And they talk a lot about self-defense weapons, and they show these AR-15s and these semi-automatics, and they talk about them as self-defense weapons. And then the idea of protecting your family. So, and the idea of freedom and liberty. So there's that authoritarian idea of the strict father has the responsibility and must be disciplined enough to protect his own family first and foremost, and that is his responsibility, no one else's. So you can see how important it is to start framing this more in terms of empathy and caring about children who are potentially at risk, or other people who are potentially at risk, and that there needs to be a balance and a responsibility of the freedom to own a weapon coming with a responsibility to other people. Yeah, and Steve, to your point, I don't think that would do any good anyway. I mean, it's interesting that's, but again, in spite of the facts, it's a very powerful message, because the people who believe this idea of self-defense and protecting your family, the facts are not going to move them off of that message. What will move them is the idea that, hey, this could happen to someone you love. This could happen to someone in your family, someone on your street, and we have a responsibility to those people's freedoms over our own self-interest. So finally, and here, this is where our discussion of the history of the Second Amendment, understanding how Republican policies impact people's lives and freedoms come in, is that the facts matter in the context of the frame. So presenting people with historical facts about how our lack of action on gun safety and taking responsibility for other people, how it affects people's lives and freedoms in a very, very bad way. We have lots of stories that we can tell about this and make and put into public discourse. And it really talks about the consequences of inaction and what we can do together to protect each other. That's interesting. And I'm sure that for a very small number of people, that evangelical end times is an issue. I think, yeah, Jeff's making a good point. Yes, amendments are subject to interpretation, and so is the court on every issue. Is how the court rules is subject to interpretation, and largely the dominant frame. If progressives want gun safety, how can we oppose speech safety or religion safety? I just want to make sure I understand your question, Jeff. So if we want gun safety, in other words, if somebody, that we expect somebody to register a weapon, have a license, and take responsibility for that ownership, how can we oppose speech safety or religion safety?
If somebody opposes what we say
Mm-hmm.
and wants to curtail the freedom of speech because of some societal good that they see, we have to defend. What we want to do is defend our values while imposing our values on others. And I don't know how to have both of those positions at the same time.
Okay, I get what you're saying. That's a great question. Right, Mark makes a good point. So the Second Amendment does limit the right to bear arms. So there is that interpretation. So beyond that, though, Jeff, to answer your question, I want to consider it in terms of the idea of freedom of speech, freedom of religion, either to practice religion or to not practice religion. I think it comes down to that idea of the golden rule, which is kind of what empathy is based on, is this idea to do unto others as you would have done to you, right? So you wouldn't want to have somebody malign you in such a way to harm you with something they say or something they do. So the same should be true of others, and the same with religion. You should have the freedom to either practice the religion of your choice or to not practice any religion at all, and to have that freedom. And I think right. Thank you, Steve. That's the word. That's the phrase of the slippery slope. As opposed to thinking of it in terms of actual application of really caring for others without providing some kind of slippery slope litmus test or slippery slope argument that takes it to an extreme, and the freedom. I'm trying to keep up with everybody's comments here too. Right. So to Steve's point, the slippery slope going to an extreme that you can object to something because it poses direct harm to others. And even I think Lakoff wrote a really well designed argument that hate speech is not free speech. For the reason that it actually can psychologically harm someone. We have evidence that it can psychologically harm someone. So raising the question that your freedom to say something that can psychologically harm someone is actually not a freedom that we should recognize because it's harming someone. So I think
can you hear me when we're
yes, I can, Jeff. Go ahead.
How do we come up with a rule or a concept that applies equally to all amendments and attempts to curtail them, that does not seem like we are for what we're for and against what we're against?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's that, as a philosophy major, I think that way.
Sure. Right.
And you're for something beyond my personal values that's logical.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Can you give me an example where you think that would apply, as opposed to thinking? Because thinking abstractly, you can create virtually any argument for or against a particular amendment in a certain circumstance, thinking in abstraction. But do you have a specific something that's gnawing at you?
Well, the way my understanding is, the way it works, there's not, for example, since I'm a writer, I think of the First Amendment, there's no prior restraint. We don't stop people from doing something before they do it, but there's punishment afterwards. If you violate somebody's rights, they can come after you, but we don't stop people ahead of time. That's the Pentagon Papers and the
Sure.
Times versus Sullivan in these cases.
Sure.
In the gun issue, we're doing it ahead of time. We want to do it ahead of time, and we don't. If somebody stops you from voting, there's really nothing you can do about it to vote. But you can. Let's say that they want to stop blacks from voting in the South. They want to control the outcome. We would oppose that. Mm-hmm. Because a majority should not control what a majority does. And the same with the guns. If voting is a right, then having a gun is a right.
Sure.
How do we justify the imposition of control over guns any more than over voting?
Okay, so
this is abstract and maybe beyond the scope. It is abstract,
but in terms of political application and public policy, to cast a vote is a fundamental right for people to take action to have their voice represented in our republic. So unless you're talking about an extreme, you are not going to harm anyone by exercising your freedom to vote. I think that even in abstract, that would be largely agreed upon. So just like driving a car, which you could say that in this day and age, most people need to drive a car in order to exercise their pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness, that the misuse of that car could cause you to impede someone's freedom to pursue life, liberty, and happiness. Mm-hmm. Therefore, we should have certain protections in place so that people are responsible for their behavior in using their car or their gun.
You're right, but the responsibility comes after the act, right? That if you get in an accident, you're responsible. If you drink and drive and you hit somebody, then you're responsible. You're not responsible until you do it.
But you still have to register that vehicle, and you still have to license, and you still have to demonstrate proficiency, a moderate amount of proficiency to be able to operate that vehicle.
That's true.
Yeah, and you're limited, like how fast you can drive, or whether or not you can speed through a school zone, or have insurance on your vehicle. All of these are limitations on the quote-unquote right to drive, and we accept those limitations in those areas of our life. And the whole thing of like not calling out fire in a crowded theater, that is a preemptive limitation with consequences after the action. But, you know, we make it clear.
It's not preemptive, it's punishable.
Well,
it doesn't stop you from doing it. I mean,
as a writer,
go ahead.
Also, as a writer, I know that the rules of slander prevent me from writing certain things that I might like to write.
Yeah, and shooting somebody also is punishable.
Right. So,
well, I think
the consequences afterwards, not before.
Right, consequences are afterwards, but the boundaries are set up prior.
Yeah, that's true.
Right, and the other thing I would throw in here is that when you're talking about punishable consequences, that's legal. That's a legal function, and when what we're trying to do is we're trying to create a moral. We're trying to reinforce a moral frame that says that your freedoms have a responsibility to the freedoms of others, and that sets the framework for how laws and amendments can be interpreted or established.
Somehow I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, as Nancy points out that Germany has outlawed diesel cars for public health purposes, or they're in the process of. So, again, another important reason to discuss gun safety in terms of public health. Clearly, they pose a public health risk, which would, mandate us to provide protections proactively, if you will, because our values say that we should do that we should care about those kids that are being shot, or we should care about, people walking down the street that have easy access to these deadly weapons, and that we ought to protect people from having that happen. And Jeff, to your point, I very much like how Kathleen Weinhaut has talked about this for years in her very large hunting district, is that, look, she herself is a hunter and says, I agree with that you should have the freedom to enjoy hunting with your rifle, whatever, right? But, my responsibility as a legislator is to make sure that first of all, the wrong people don't get their hands on them, and that we protect people from that happening, and that we also protect people from having the types of guns that are only used to kill hundreds of people at a time. And that we have some responsibility to protect each other's freedoms so that you can enjoy hunting with your rifle, and you can enjoy that responsibly. And I think that's part of the reason why she's done so well in her district, is she addresses her issue in such a way that even gun owners agree that, yes, I should handle it responsibly, and that we should be able to protect each other. And I think if you look at, surveys and things, the majority of people agree with this. So, yeah, but good discussion and really good things to consider here. And yes, I mean, the golden rule is very important, because no matter what religion you are, there's some aspect of the golden rule to do unto others, and certainly it's something important to evoke. So I just want to reinforce here that when, any issue you're talking about, a message based on your values and beliefs, and again, we're talking moral frames, authoritarian or empathy, are greater to motivate and inspire people than facts and issues. And facts matter in terms of supporting the frame, the values and beliefs are primary. And this idea of a positive, hopeful vision is more powerful than a negative fear of loss message. So this is a difficult one on this issue, but it is possible to provide a positive, hopeful vision for a future where kids don't have to be afraid to go to school or walk the streets, or people don't have to be afraid of these deadly semi-automatic assault rifles being available to the wrong people. And kind of a simple message would be, all you have to do is care about other people, and we can make that happen. So, yeah, I like that, the NRA rule of gold. Right, so kids don't have to have mass shooter drills, right? I mean, I got an email from my son's school that they're having a mass shooter drill this week. So, yeah, exactly. So just to recap, 11. So he's 11, he's in middle school. So, yeah. So just to recap, this idea of stop, drop, and roll is something that consciously happens. Frame every issue around empathy, the public as the foundation of democracy, economy, and prosperity. And obviously on this issue, the foundation of the freedom to live, the ability to live free from fear in this case. To know the conservative metaphors and ideas like gun control, like self-defense weapons, like my freedom to own a gun and to stop using them, and then to understand history and be able to convey a story that evokes empathy and communicates to people how historically Republican policies, particularly on guns, have a negative impact on people's lives and freedom. I did not see the president's performance on gun safety yet today. Sorry. I not have a chance to see that. I will have to. Military weaponry, I've seen the idea of calling them deadly force weapons or deadly weapons or military weapons, right, that kind of thing, work well also. I had another thing to share here that I actually just saw before we started, and it's from a blog by an international security expert at DePaul University. The name of the blog is actually International Security. And his name is Tom Okaitis. He's at DePaul. And the title of the blog is "The Answer to Gun Violence is Not More Guns." So kind of mixed messaging there. But one of the things that he actually did really well was to frame the facts about the issue. And he talks about how the NRA is going on the offensive by talking about getting more guns in school. Getting more guns in school is the answer. And what he says is, I gotta find it's on my phone, so give me a second, I'll find it. Oh, here we go. He says, so he says the tragedy of Parkland is the latest chapter in a long, sad story with one inescapable conclusion. There is no substitute for reasonable gun safety laws. These laws need not infringe on the rights of responsible sports people. He says, no hunter or target shooter needs a bump stock, automatic conversion kit, high-capacity magazine, et cetera, et cetera. Assault rifles are for battlefields. And then he says, the right to bear arms in the Second Amendment is but one freedom guaranteed Americans. So there's this idea of freedom to live a life without fear of getting gunned down. The drafters of the Bill of Rights never intended it to take precedence over the rights of children and young adults to attend school in a safe and secure environment. And he provides some really good examples of the idea that having guns in school doesn't work. He's a security expert, so that's where he goes. And he talks about specific cases where having guns on site did not stop anything. And the idea that this school, what's getting lost in all the messaging is that this school is a multi-building campus serving almost 3,000 students, and that the shooter took just 6 minutes to kill 17 people. And from a security standpoint, it's understandable that a sheriff outside thought that the gunfire was happening outside. And that in all honesty, from a security standpoint, he could have never located, identified, and taken down an active shooter in such a crowded, chaotic environment in so little time. So there's a case where he frames it well by talking about the responsibility and the rights of children to attend school in a safe and secure environment, and then kind of the how unsensical it is to think that one person could have stopped it. I'll post that on my website and send it an email, but he has an excellent blog that provides a stark reality to a lot of security issues. What I'll do is I'll type his name at least in the chat box here so you can see it. It's Tom Kaitis, and it's the International Security is the blog. There we go. And it's just a WordPress blog, so it's free. And in terms of security things, he has really great points based on real life policy and practice of security. So so there you go. Some ideas to frame the gun safety issue. And again, gun safety, it's public health, our responsibility towards others is a big part of this. So if there's not any other questions, okay, I'm guessing I may see some of you tomorrow night doing a McCabe campaign webinar tomorrow night. So I might see some of you on that tomorrow night. And otherwise, I will post this as soon as it's up, along with the link to the blog. Oh,
Scott, how about if I send a link to that article by Tom Hartman as well?
That'd be great. Yes.
Okay.
Yep. That'd be great. In fact, Mark, if you want to copy and paste it into the chat box, I'm going to download the chat box so I can post it.
Whoops. Whoop. I haven't lost you. Okay.
No,
It's going to take me a second.
Any other questions, comments, announcements? Okay.
Okay. Okay, I've got it.
Great. Well, thanks everybody for attending. Look for this recording to be up by the end of the week. I'm working on a blog that's kind of along this same lines. Should be done tomorrow as well. It's kind of a me versus we mentality type of thing. So
I'm sorry I can't get back to you to post it. I'll send you an email.
Okay, sounds good, and then I'll send it out.
I'll do it right now.
Got it.
Thanks.
All right. All right, thanks everybody. I'm going to end the meeting now. Have a great night.
You too.
Thanks.